She was known as the White Bride, and her beauty was as fleeting as the foam upon the waves, for the sea demanded its tribute.
Have you ever seen such fine embroidery?
She is radiant, a true vision of spring and prosperity.
Look at the ermine. I have never seen such fine brocade.
Brides have always worn white.
The story of the white wedding dress is one of those cultural myths that feels so natural, so unquestioned, that many people assume it must stretch back into the deepest layers of human history. Ask someone why brides wear white, and the answer often comes quickly, because it symbolizes purity, innocence, and tradition. It is presented as timeless, as if every bride across centuries and continents has always stepped forward in a gown of spotless white, embodying a ritual older than memory itself. But is that really true? Right or wrong? Is the white wedding dress truly an age-old ritual, or is it a much more recent invention dressed up as ancient tradition? To begin, we need to understand why this myth has such staying power. Myths thrive when they are simple, emotionally resonant, and repeated often enough to become common sense. The white wedding dress fits all three criteria. It is visually striking, easy to remember, and tied to powerful ideas about morality, sexuality, and family. It is reinforced by countless films, advertisements, and photographs, and it is repeated in everyday speech. Of course, brides wear white. That's just how it's always been. The repetition itself becomes evidence, even when history tells a different story. The idea of white as a symbol of purity is not unique to weddings. Across cultures, white has often been associated with ritual cleanliness, spiritual renewal, or sacred occasions. In ancient Rome, priests wore white robes to signify their closeness to the divine. In many societies, white clothing was used for funerals, marking the passage of the soul into another realm. In Christian iconography, angels are depicted in white, and baptismal garments are white to symbolize rebirth. So when people say the white wedding dress is ancient, they are not entirely inventing the association between white and purity. What they are doing, however, is projecting that association backward onto weddings themselves, as if brides in every era naturally chose white for the same reasons. That projection is the myth. If we look at the historical record, the evidence tells a different story. For most of human history, weddings were not about fashion statements or symbolic colors. They were about alliances, property, and survival. The garments worn by brides reflected wealth, status, and local custom far more than any universal symbolism. In medieval Europe, for example, brides often wore their best dress, whatever color it happened to be. Red was popular in many regions, symbolizing fertility and prosperity. Blue was associated with the Virgin Mary and thus carried connotations of faithfulness. Gold and richly embroidered fabrics signaled wealth. White, by contrast, was rare, impractical, and often avoided because it stained easily and was difficult to maintain. The notion that white was the default choice simply does not hold up under scrutiny. So why do so many people believe otherwise? Part of the answer lies in the way traditions are invented and then retroactively naturalized. Historians of culture often point out that what feels timeless is often surprisingly recent. A practice emerges in a particular moment, gains popularity, and then is rebranded as ancient custom. The white wedding dress is a perfect example of this process. It became fashionable in the 19th century, spread rapidly through media and industry, and was then presented as if it had always been the norm. The myth persists because it is useful. It gives weddings a sense of continuity, stability, and moral authority. It reassures families that they are participating in something bigger than themselves, something rooted in the deep past. Another reason the myth endures is that it aligns with broader cultural narratives about women, sexuality, and morality. The idea that a bride should wear white to symbolize virginity reinforces patriarchal expectations about female purity. It suggests that a woman's value is tied to her sexual history, and that the wedding is the moment when her purity is publicly displayed and transferred to her husband. This narrative has been challenged and critiqued, but it remains embedded in popular culture. By presenting the white dress as ancient, society naturalizes these expectations, making them seem inevitable rather than constructed. It is also important to note how the myth is reinforced by visual culture. Photographs of weddings, especially from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, overwhelmingly feature brides in white. These images circulate widely, becoming the default representation of marriage. Films and television shows repeat the same imagery, cementing the association in the public imagination. Advertising by bridal companies and magazines further amplifies the message: white is the only proper choice. Over time, the sheer volume of images creates the illusion of timelessness. People rarely see depictions of brides in other colors, so they assume white must have always been the case. But myths are not just about ignorance, they are about power. The white wedding dress myth serves particular interests. It benefits the bridal industry, which profits from selling gowns that are marketed as traditional and essential. It benefits patriarchal structures, which use the symbolism of purity to regulate women's bodies and choices. And it benefits cultural elites, who can present their own practices as universal, erasing the diversity of wedding traditions across cultures. By framing the white dress as ancient, these groups legitimize their authority and marginalize alternatives. This chapter, then, is about setting the stage. We are not yet diving into the specifics of Queen Victoria's wedding, or the role of industrialization. That will come later. For now, we are asking the foundational question: why do people believe the white wedding dress is an age-old ritual? And what does that belief accomplish? The answer is that the myth persists because it is emotionally powerful, visually reinforced, and socially useful. It gives weddings a veneer of timelessness, even when the historical evidence points to a much more recent origin. To illustrate this point, consider how myths function in everyday life. When someone says brides have always worn white, they are not making a historical claim based on archival research. They are expressing a cultural assumption, one that feels true because it is repeated so often. The statement is less about history and more about identity. It tells us who we are, what we value, and how we imagine continuity with the past.
Myths like this are not easily dismantled because they serve psychological and social needs. They provide stability in a world of change. They make rituals feel sacred, and they connect individuals to a larger narrative. Yet myths can also be dangerous when they obscure reality. By presenting the white wedding dress as ancient, society erases the diversity of past practices and imposes a narrow standard on the present. It silences the voices of women who wore red, blue, or patterned gowns. It marginalizes cultures where weddings had entirely different symbols and meanings, and it perpetuates a patriarchal narrative that equates purity with whiteness, both in clothing and in racialized terms. To challenge the myth is not just to correct a historical error, it is to question the structures of power that benefit from that error. As we move forward in this series, we will trace the actual history of the white wedding dress.
We will see how it emerged in specific contexts, how it spread through media and industry, and how it was imposed globally through colonial encounters. We will also explore the ways people have resisted and reimagined the tradition. But before we do that, it is crucial to recognize the myth itself and understand why it matters. The myth of timeless purity is not just a harmless story. It is a cultural force that shapes how people think about marriage, morality, and identity. So let us return to the central question. Right or wrong, is the white wedding dress truly an age-old ritual? At this stage, we can already see cracks in the narrative. The evidence suggests that white was not the default choice in ancient or medieval times. The association with purity, while real in other contexts, was not specifically tied to weddings. The widespread adoption of white gowns is a relatively recent phenomenon. The myth, therefore, is wrong in its claim of timelessness.
But it is right in revealing something deeper: the human desire to anchor rituals in the past, to make them feel eternal, even when they are modern inventions. This tension between myth and reality is at the heart of our investigation. Myths are not simply falsehoods. They are stories that people believe because they serve a purpose.
The white wedding dress myth serves the purpose of continuity, morality, and identity. It tells us who we are supposed to be, even if history tells us otherwise. By exposing the myth, we do not destroy the ritual. We open space for new possibilities. We allow people to choose colors and symbols that reflect their own values, rather than conforming to a fabricated tradition. In closing this chapter, we have set the stage for the journey ahead. We have identified the myth of timeless purity, explained why it persists, and highlighted its social functions.
We have begun to dismantle the assumption that white is ancient, showing that it is instead a modern invention dressed up as tradition. In the chapters to come, we will trace the specific historical moments that gave birth to the white wedding dress, from Queen Victoria's choice to the rise of industrial fashion, from colonial imposition to Hollywood glamour. Each step will bring us closer to answering the central question with clarity and honesty. For now, we leave with this thought: myths matter, not because they are true, but because they shape how we live. And the myth of the white wedding dress is one of the most enduring and revealing of them all. When we peel back the layers of myth surrounding the white wedding dress, the first thing we discover is that for most of human history, brides did not wear white at all. In fact, the idea that white was the universal color of weddings before the modern era is not only inaccurate, it is almost the opposite of the truth. Across cultures and centuries, brides wore garments that reflected wealth, local symbolism, and practicality. Red, gold, blue, and richly patterned fabrics dominated the scene, while white was rare, often avoided, and certainly not the default. To dismantle the myth of timeless purity, we need to look closely at what brides actually wore in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, and beyond. Let us begin with ancient Rome, a society whose rituals have often been retroactively linked to modern traditions. Roman brides did wear a garment called the tunica recta, woven in a traditional style, and they covered themselves with a veil known as the flammeum. The veil was not white, but flame-colored, bright orange or deep red, symbolizing fire, fertility, and the protection of the household gods. The bride's hair was parted with a spear, a gesture that connected marriage to martial power and ancestral lineage. In other words, Roman weddings were saturated with symbolism, but none of it revolved around the whiteness of the dress. The colors chosen were vivid, practical, and deeply tied to Roman ideas of family and continuity. To imagine Roman brides in white gowns is to project a modern fantasy backward onto a culture that had its own very different codes. Moving forward into the medieval period, we find even greater diversity. In Europe, weddings were not primarily about romance, but about alliances, property, and social status. The garments worn by brides reflected this reality. A noblewoman might wear a gown of red silk embroidered with gold thread, signaling her family's wealth and prestige. Blue was also popular, associated with the Virgin Mary, and thus carrying connotations of faithfulness and devotion. In some regions, green symbolized fertility and renewal. Patterns and textures mattered as much as color. Brocade, velvet, and fur linings were prized, and the richness of the fabric was a visible marker of status. White, by contrast, was impractical. It stained easily, was difficult to clean, and lacked the visual impact of brighter colors. For most medieval brides, wearing white would have been a poor choice, both materially and symbolically. It is worth pausing here to consider why white was so impractical. Before the advent of modern laundering techniques and chemical bleaching, maintaining a white garment was nearly impossible. Dirt and sweat quickly discolored the fabric, and stains were difficult to remove. In societies where clothing was expensive and often reused, a white gown would have been a liability.
Brides typically wore their best dress, which was often reused for other occasions. That dress was rarely white, because white was not a practical color for garments meant to last. The notion of a single-use white gown, worn once and preserved as a single, is a modern luxury, not a medieval reality. Beyond Europe, the diversity of wedding attire becomes even more striking. In China, red has long been the traditional color for weddings, symbolizing luck, joy, and prosperity. Brides wore elaborate red robes embroidered with gold, and the color red dominated the entire ceremony, from decorations to gifts. In India, brides traditionally wore red or saffron saris, again emphasizing fertility and auspiciousness. In Japan, brides often wore richly patterned kimonos, with colors chosen to reflect family status and seasonal symbolism. In Africa, wedding attire varied widely, but bright colors, intricate patterns, and symbolic adornments were common. In all these cases, white was not the default. It was either absent or reserved for other rituals, such as funerals. This global diversity matters because it exposes the Eurocentric bias of the white wedding myth. When people claim that brides have always worn white, they are not only ignoring the realities of European history, but also erasing the traditions of non-European cultures. The myth universalizes a practice that was never universal, imposing a narrow standard on a wide range of human experience. By recovering the colors of ancient and medieval weddings, we restore the richness of cultural diversity and challenge the homogenizing narrative of white as timeless. It is also important to recognize that even within Europe, the symbolism of colors was complex and varied. Red could symbolize fertility, but it could also be associated with sin or danger. Blue could represent faithfulness, but it could also be linked to melancholy.
Gold signaled wealth, but it could also evoke vanity. Brides and families chose colors strategically, balancing symbolism with practicality. The idea that white uniquely symbolized purity is a simplification that ignores the nuanced ways people used color to communicate meaning. Purity itself was often symbolized by blue, not white, in medieval iconography. The Virgin Mary, the archetype of purity, was almost always depicted in blue robes. To claim that white was the ancient symbol of purity is to misread the visual language of the past. Another layer of complexity comes from the fact that weddings were public spectacles. The garments worn by brides were meant to impress, to display wealth and status to the community. Bright colors and rich fabrics achieved this effect far better than plain white. A bride in a red silk gown embroidered with gold thread would have been a dazzling sight, signaling her family's prosperity and her own importance.
A bride in a plain white dress, by contrast, might have seemed underdressed or impoverished. The association of white with luxury only emerged later, when bleaching techniques and industrial production made it possible to produce dazzling white fabrics. In the medieval period, white was not luxurious, it was impractical and unremarkable. So how did the myth of ancient white weddings emerge? Part of the answer lies in the way later generations reinterpreted the past. When Queen Victoria wore a white gown in 1840, her choice was presented as a revival of ancient purity. Writers and commentators retroactively linked her dress to Roman and medieval symbolism, even though the historical evidence did not support the claim. Over time, these reinterpretations hardened into myth. The white dress was presented as timeless, and the colorful diversity of the past was forgotten.
This process of selective memory is common in cultural history. Practices are rebranded as ancient to give them legitimacy, even when they are relatively new. By examining ancient and medieval wedding attire, we dismantle the idea that white was universal. We see instead a rich tapestry of colors and symbols, each reflecting the values and realities of its time. Roman brides wore flame-colored veils. Medieval brides wore red and blue gowns. Chinese brides wore red robes. Indian brides wore saffron saris. Japanese brides wore patterned kimonos. African brides wore vibrant textiles. White was rare, impractical, and often absent. The myth of timeless purity collapses under the weight of historical evidence. This chapter also invites us to reflect on the power of clothing as cultural expression. Wedding attire is not just decoration, it is a statement about identity, community, and values. By choosing colors and fabrics, families communicated their place in society and their hopes for the future. To reduce this diversity to a single color is to erase the complexity of human experience. It is to impose a narrow narrative on a wide range of practices. By recovering the colors of ancient and medieval weddings, we honor the richness of cultural history and resist the homogenizing force of myth. As we move forward, we will see how the white wedding dress emerged in the 19th century, how it spread through industrialization and media, and how it was imposed globally through colonial encounters. But it is crucial to begin with this foundation, the recognition that white was not ancient, not universal, and not inevitable. The myth of timeless purity is wrong,
and the evidence of ancient and medieval colors proves it. By dismantling the myth, we open space for new understandings of tradition, identity, and choice.
In closing this chapter, let us remember that history is not a straight line leading inevitably to the present. It is a tapestry of practices, symbols, and meanings, many of which have been forgotten or erased. The white wedding dress is not the culmination of an ancient tradition. It is a modern invention that has been retroactively projected onto the past. By recovering the colors of ancient and medieval weddings, we challenge the myth and prepare to trace the real history of how white became dominant. The journey ahead will show us how power, fashion, and industry transformed a rare choice into a global standard. For now, we leave with this truth. Before white, there was red, gold, blue, and every color of human imagination.
When we think of the white wedding dress today, one name inevitably rises to the surface: Queen Victoria. Her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840 is often credited with popularizing the white gown, transforming what had been a rare and impractical choice into a powerful fashion trend that would ripple across Europe and eventually the world. But to understand why Victoria's dress mattered so much, we need to look beyond the fabric itself. Her choice was political, fashionable, and symbolic. It was amplified by media coverage, and it became mythologized as tradition. This chapter explores how one royal moment reshaped the cultural imagination of weddings. Let us begin with the context. In the early 19th century, Britain was undergoing profound change. Industrialization was transforming cities and economies. The monarchy, though still powerful, was under pressure to adapt to a rapidly modernizing society.
Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, a young woman of 18, embodying both continuity and renewal. Her marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was not just a personal union, but a political statement. It was meant to stabilize the monarchy, reinforce alliances, and present Victoria as a moral, domestic figure in contrast to the scandal-ridden monarchs who had preceded her. Every detail of the wedding was carefully orchestrated to send a message, and the dress was no exception. Victoria's gown was made of white silk satin, trimmed with Honiton lace, and paired with a wreath of orange blossoms. At first glance, it might seem like a simple fashion choice, but in fact, it was loaded with meaning. White silk was expensive and difficult to maintain, signaling wealth and status. Honiton lace was handmade in Devon, supporting British industry at a time when machine-made lace threatened traditional crafts.
The orange blossoms symbolized fertility and innocence, connecting Victoria to older European traditions. By choosing this ensemble, Victoria was not just dressing herself, she was dressing the monarchy in a narrative of purity, domesticity, and national pride. The political dimension of the gown is crucial. Victoria deliberately avoided wearing silver or gold, which were common choices for royal brides, because she wanted to emphasize simplicity and morality. She presented herself as a woman of the people, choosing a dress that, while luxurious, could be imitated by others. This was a calculated move to align the monarchy with middle-class values of modesty and domestic virtue. At a time when Britain was grappling with industrial unrest and social change, Victoria's white gown reassured the public that the monarchy was stable, moral, and in touch with ordinary life. It was a political costume as much as a bridal one. The fashionable dimension is equally important.
White was not unheard of in bridal attire before Victoria, but it was far from common. Wealthy brides occasionally wore white to display their ability to afford a garment that would stain easily and be worn only once. But Victoria's choice elevated white from a rare luxury to a fashionable ideal. Because she was queen, her dress was widely reported and imitated. Fashion magazines published illustrations of the gown, and descriptions circulated across Europe. The image of Victoria in white became iconic, setting a new standard for bridal fashion. What had been a marginal choice became a trend, and the trend quickly hardened into expectation. The symbolic dimension ties all of this together. Victoria's white gown was presented as a symbol of purity and innocence, reinforcing patriarchal narratives about female virtue. But it also symbolized national pride, industrial craftsmanship, and royal domesticity.
It was a garment that carried multiple layers of meaning, each resonating with different audiences. For the monarchy, it was a political statement. For fashionistas, it was a trendsetter. For moralists, it was a symbol of virtue. For artisans, it was a showcase of British lace. The genius of the gown was that it could be all of these things at once, making it a powerful cultural artifact. Media coverage amplified the impact. Victoria's wedding was one of the first to be widely reported in newspapers and magazines, thanks to the expansion of print culture in the 19th century. Illustrations of the gown circulated, and descriptions emphasized its whiteness and simplicity. The press framed the dress as both fashionable and moral, reinforcing the narrative that white was the proper choice for brides. Over time, these reports were repeated and reinterpreted until Victoria's gown was remembered not just as a fashion trend, but as the origin of a timeless tradition.
The myth of the ancient white wedding was born, even though the practice was barely a few decades old. It is worth noting that Victoria herself did not intend to create a universal tradition. She chose white for specific reasons, political, fashionable, symbolic, but she did not claim that brides had always worn white or that they should always do so. The myth emerged later, as commentators retroactively linked her choice to ancient purity rituals and presented it as timeless. This process of myth-making is common in cultural history. A practice begins in a specific context, gains popularity, and then rebranded as ancient custom. Victoria's gown became the anchor for this narrative, even though it was a modern invention. The impact of Victoria's choice was not immediate or universal. For several decades after 1840, brides continued to wear a variety of colors, especially in rural areas and among the working class. White was popular among the wealthy, but it was not yet dominant.
It took time for the trend to spread, aided by industrialization, photography, and media. By the late 19th century, however, white had become the fashionable norm, and Victoria's gown was remembered as the origin point. The myth solidified, erasing the diversity of earlier practices and presenting white as timeless. This chapter also invites us to reflect on the role of queens and power in shaping cultural trends. Victoria's gown mattered not because it was objectively superior, but because she was queen. Her choices carried symbolic weight, and her image was widely disseminated. In this sense, the white wedding dress is a product of power as much as fashion. It became tradition because a queen wore it, and because the media amplified it. Ordinary women did not invent the white gown. It was imposed from above, then naturalized as universal.
This dynamic reveals how traditions are often shaped by elites and then presented as timeless, obscuring their origins in specific moments of power. The myth of Victoria's gown also reflects broader narratives about gender and morality. By presenting white as a symbol of purity, society reinforced patriarchal expectations about women's sexuality. The gown became a public display of virginity, a ritualized performance of innocence. This narrative was not ancient. It was constructed in the 19th century, tied to Victorian ideals of domesticity and morality. By linking it to Victoria's gown, commentators gave it legitimacy, presenting it as timeless, even though it was modern. The myth thus served to regulate women's bodies and choices, making the white gown not just a fashion trend, but a tool of social control. At the same time, the gown was celebrated as a symbol of love and romance.
Victoria and Albert were presented as a couple united by affection rather than politics, and the white gown reinforced this narrative. It suggested that marriage was about purity and devotion, not just alliances and property. This romantic framing was part of the broader Victorian reimagining of marriage, which emphasized love and domesticity. The white gown became a visual symbol of this shift, aligning the monarchy with middle-class ideals of romance and morality. In this sense, the gown was both a political costume and a romantic symbol, bridging the gap between elite power and popular sentiment. The legacy of Victoria's gown is profound. It set the stage for the industrial and media forces that would cement white as the dominant choice in the 20th century. It created the myth of timeless purity, which continues to shape weddings today. And it revealed the power of queens and media to transform fashion into tradition. By examining Victoria's gown, we see how a single royal moment became mythologized as ancient custom, even though it was a modern invention. The white wedding dress is not timeless. It is the product of power,
fashion, and myth-making. As we move forward, we will explore how industrialization, photography, and consumer culture spread the white gown beyond the elite, making it accessible to ordinary brides. We will see how colonial encounters exported the tradition globally, and how Hollywood and advertising reinforced it. But it all begins here, with Queen Victoria in 1840, stepping into a white silk gown that would change the cultural imagination of weddings forever. Her choice was political, fashionable, and symbolic. It was amplified by media, and it became mythologized as tradition. The myth of the ancient white wedding dress begins not in antiquity, but in the 19th century, with a queen who understood the power of clothing to shape history. If Queen Victoria's 1840 wedding planted the seed of the white gown, it was the forces of industrialization, photography, and mass media that watered it, nurtured it, and spread it until it became the dominant symbol of marriage across much of the world. The 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of extraordinary technological and cultural transformation. Factories churned out textiles at unprecedented speed. Photography captured and circulated images of brides, and newspapers and magazines amplified the fashion until it seemed universal. What had once been a rare luxury became accessible to a growing middle class, and what had once been a royal fashion statement hardened into a consumer expectation. This chapter explores how technology and consumer culture, not timeless ritual, cemented the white wedding dress. To understand this transformation, we must first consider the Industrial Revolution's impact on textiles. Before industrialization, fabrics were expensive, labor-intensive, and often handmade. A richly embroidered gown could take weeks or months to produce, and only the wealthy could afford garments that were worn once and preserved. White fabrics in particular were difficult to maintain, as bleaching was costly and stains were nearly impossible to remove. But with the rise of mechanized textile production, bleaching techniques improved, and white fabrics became more widely available. Cotton, silk, and lace could be produced in larger quantities, and chemical processes made dazzling whiteness achievable. Suddenly, the white gown was not just a symbol of elite luxury, it was a possibility for the expanding middle class. Industrialization also changed the economics of clothing. As fabrics became cheaper, the idea of a single-use gown became more feasible. Brides who might once have worn their best dress, regardless of color, could now afford a gown specifically for the wedding.
The white dress, once impractical, became a fashionable choice for those who wanted to emulate elite styles. This democratization of fashion was not about ancient ritual, it was about industrial production and consumer access. The white gown spread not because it was timeless, but because factories made it affordable. Photography added another layer of transformation. In the mid-19th century, photography was still a novelty, but by the late 19th century, it had become a common way to document important events. Weddings were among the most photographed occasions, and the images that circulated overwhelmingly featured brides in white. The camera, in effect, standardized the image of the wedding. Photographs reinforced the association between marriage and whiteness, creating a visual archive that shaped public imagination.
Families displayed wedding portraits in their homes. Magazines published photographs of elite weddings, and the repetition of white gowns and images created the illusion of universality. The myth of timeless purity was not just spoken, it was seen, captured, and reproduced. Photography also changed the meaning of the gown itself. A white dress photographed well, reflecting light and creating a striking image. Darker colors could appear heavy or indistinct in early photographs, while white stood out vividly. This technical factor reinforced the popularity of white, as brides and photographers alike preferred the aesthetic impact of a white gown. The camera thus played a crucial role in cementing the association between weddings and whiteness, not because of ancient symbolism, but because of technological aesthetics. Mass media amplified these trends. Newspapers, magazines, and later advertising promoted the white gown as the fashionable choice.
Bridal magazines emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, showcasing white dresses as the ideal. Illustrations and photographs of royal and elite weddings circulated widely, presenting white as the standard.
Advertisers capitalized on the trend, marketing fabrics, lace, and gowns to aspiring brides. The message was clear: to be modern, respectable, and fashionable, one must wear white. The repetition of this message across media created a cultural expectation, transforming a recent fashion into a supposed tradition. Consumer culture played a decisive role. As industrialization created new markets, weddings became opportunities for consumption. The white gown was marketed not just as clothing, but as a symbol of identity, morality, and status. Bridal companies promoted the idea that a proper wedding required a white dress, and families invested in gowns to display their respectability.
The gown became a commodity, sold through shops and catalogs, advertised in magazines, and reinforced by media images. What had once been a royal fashion statement became a profitable industry. The myth of timeless purity was not ancient. It was manufactured by consumer culture. It is important to note that this process was uneven. Not all brides wore white in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Working-class women often continued to wear their best dress, regardless of color, because practicality mattered more than fashion. In rural areas, colorful gowns remained common. But the cultural pressure to conform to white grew steadily, especially in urban centers and among the middle class. The spread of white was not universal, but it was relentless, driven by industrial production, photography, and media. Over time, the diversity of colors was marginalized, and white became the dominant symbol.
This chapter also invites us to reflect on the relationship between technology and tradition. The white gown is often presented as timeless, but its dominance is inseparable from technological change. Industrialization made white fabrics accessible. Photography made white gowns visually striking and memorable. Mass media amplified the fashion until it seemed universal. Tradition, in this case, was not ancient but manufactured by technology. The myth of timeless purity is a product of modernity, not antiquity. The rise of consumer culture also reshaped the meaning of weddings themselves. As white gowns became standard, weddings became increasingly commercialized. Families invested in gowns, photographs, decorations, and ceremonies, creating a market for bridal goods. The white gown was central to this market, symbolizing not just purity, but consumption. To wear white was to participate in a modern consumer ritual, one that reinforced social status and identity.
The myth of timeless purity thus served the interests of industry and commerce, legitimizing consumption by presenting it as tradition. We can see this dynamic in the way bridal magazines framed the white gown. Articles emphasized its moral symbolism, presenting it as a reflection of purity and innocence, but they also promoted specific fabrics, styles, and designers, turning morality into marketing. The gown was sold not just as a garment, but as a moral necessity, a tradition that every bride must uphold. This fusion of morality and commerce is characteristic of consumer culture, and it reveals how the myth of timeless purity was constructed. It was not simply about symbolism, it was about selling products. The spread of white also intersected with broader cultural narratives about gender and morality. The white gown reinforced patriarchal expectations about female purity, presenting virginity as a public performance.
It suggested that a woman's value was tied to her sexual history and that the wedding was the moment when her purity was displayed and transferred. This narrative was not ancient. It was constructed in the 19th century, tied to Victorian ideals of domesticity and morality. By presenting it as tradition, society naturalized these expectations, making them seem inevitable rather than constructed. The white gown thus served as a tool of social control, regulating women's bodies and choices. At the same time, the gown was celebrated as a symbol of romance and modernity. Photographs of brides in white were presented as images of love, devotion, and respectability. The gown became a visual symbol of the romantic ideal, aligning marriage with modern values of affection and domesticity. This romantic framing was part of the broader reimagining of marriage in the 19th century, which emphasized love rather than alliances.
The white gown reinforced this narrative, presenting marriage as both moral and romantic. In this sense, the gown was not just a fashion trend, but a cultural symbol, embodying the values of modern society. The legacy of industrialization, photography, and mass media is profound. They transformed the white gown from a royal fashion into a cultural expectation, cementing its dominance in weddings. They created the myth of timeless purity, presenting a modern invention as ancient tradition. And they revealed the power of technology and consumer culture to shape rituals and identities. The white wedding dress is not timeless. It is the product of industrial production, visual culture, and commercial marketing. Its dominance tells us less about ancient ritual and more about modern society. As we move forward, we will explore how colonial encounters exported the white gown globally, imposing it on non-European cultures and erasing local traditions.
We will see how Hollywood and advertising reinforced the myth, turning it into a global industry. But it is crucial to recognize that the foundation was laid here, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when industrialization, photography, and mass media transformed a royal fashion into a consumer expectation. The myth of timeless purity was not ancient, it was manufactured by modernity. And it continues to shape weddings today, reminding us that tradition is often less about the past than about the power of technology and commerce to define the present.
If the 19th century Industrial Revolution and the rise of photography made the white wedding dress a fashionable norm in Europe, it was the age of empire that carried this fashion far beyond its original borders. Colonial powers did not simply export goods and governance, they exported cultural practices, rituals, and symbols. Among these was the white wedding dress, which became a visible marker of European influence in non-European societies. What had begun as a royal fashion statement in Britain was transformed into a globalized tradition, often at the expense of local customs. This chapter examines how colonization imposed the white wedding dress, how local communities resisted or adapted, and how hybrid practices emerged in the face of cultural imposition. To understand this process, we must first recognize that colonialism was not only about political control, but also about cultural domination.
European powers sought to reshape colonized societies in their own image, imposing languages, religions, and social norms. Weddings, as highly visible public rituals, became a site of cultural contestation. By encouraging or enforcing the adoption of the white gown, colonial authorities and missionaries presented European customs as superior, civilized, and timeless. The myth of the ancient white wedding was thus globalized, even though it was barely a century old. Missionaries played a central role in this process. In Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, Christian missionaries promoted European marriage rituals as part of their broader project of conversion. The white wedding dress was presented as a symbol of Christian purity and morality, reinforcing patriarchal narratives about female virtue. Local customs, whether red saris in India, patterned kimonos in Japan, or vibrant textiles in Africa, were often dismissed as pagan or backward.
Brides who adopted the white gown were praised as modern and civilized, while those who retained traditional attire were stigmatized. The white dress thus became a tool of cultural assimilation, erasing diversity in the name of morality and progress. Colonial administrations reinforced this dynamic by institutionalizing European marriage practices. Legal systems in many colonies recognized Christian marriages as legitimate, while marginalizing or invalidating local rituals. Civil registries required documentation that aligned with European norms, and photographs of brides in white became part of official records. The white gown was not just a fashion choice, it was a marker of legal recognition and social legitimacy. To marry in white was to participate in the colonial order, while to marry in traditional attire was to risk marginalization. The myth of timeless purity thus became entangled with the structures of colonial power. Yet local communities did not simply accept this imposition. Resistance took many forms, from outright rejection to subtle adaptation. In India, for example, many brides continued to wear red saris, even as colonial elites promoted white gowns. In Japan, traditional kimonos remained popular, though some brides incorporated white elements to appease modern expectations. In Africa, vibrant textiles persisted, often combined with white veils or accessories. These hybrid practices reveal the complexity of cultural encounters. People negotiated between imposed norms and local traditions, creating new forms that reflected both resistance and adaptation. Hybridization is particularly revealing because it shows how myths are contested and reshaped. The white gown was presented as ancient and universal, but local communities reinterpreted it, blending it with their own symbols and meanings. A bride might wear a white veil over a red sari, combining European purity with Indian auspiciousness.
Another might wear a white gown with African beadwork, asserting cultural identity within the imposed framework. These practices challenged the myth by exposing its modern origins and revealing the persistence of local traditions. They remind us that colonization was never total. People found ways to resist and reimagine imposed customs. The globalization of the white gown also intersected with racial hierarchies. In many colonies, wearing white was associated with European identity and privilege. Indigenous brides who adopted the gown were sometimes praised as civilized, while those who retained traditional attire were labeled primitive. The white dress thus became a racialized symbol, reinforcing colonial hierarchies of culture and identity. It was not simply about purity, it was about whiteness itself, both in fabric and in ideology. The myth of timeless purity was entangled with the myth of European superiority, making the gown a tool of racialized cultural domination. At the same time, the spread of the white gown created new markets. Colonial economies imported fabrics, lace, and gowns from Europe, creating demand for bridal goods. Local artisans sometimes adapted by producing white gowns with regional styles, blending European fashion with local craftsmanship. This commercial dimension reveals how consumer culture reinforced colonial imposition. The gown was not just a symbol, it was a commodity, sold and marketed across the empire. The myth of timeless purity thus served both ideological and economic interests, legitimizing colonial power while generating profit. The impact of this globalization was profound. In many societies, traditional wedding attire was marginalized or rebranded as ethnic or folkloric, suitable for festivals but not for proper weddings. The white gown became the standard, presented as ancient and universal.
Generations grew up believing that brides had always worn white, even in cultures where red, gold, or patterned fabrics had dominated for centuries. The myth erased history, silenced diversity, and imposed a narrow narrative of purity and civilization. It was not simply a fashion trend, it was a cultural weapon wielded by colonial powers to reshape identity. Yet resistance persisted. In the 20th century, nationalist movements often reclaimed traditional wedding attire as a symbol of cultural pride. Indian brides continued to wear red saris, Japanese brides revived elaborate kimonos, and African brides celebrated vibrant textiles. These practices challenged the colonial narrative, asserting that tradition was not white but diverse. The myth of timeless purity was exposed as a colonial invention, and alternative traditions were reasserted. Hybrid practices also flourished, reflecting the complexity of cultural encounters. The white gown was not rejected entirely, but it was reinterpreted, blended, and contested. This chapter also invites us to reflect on the broader dynamics of globalization. The white wedding dress did not spread because it was ancient or universal. It spread because colonial powers imposed it, missionaries promoted it, and consumer culture marketed it. Its globalization reveals how myths are constructed and disseminated, how power shapes tradition, and how people resist and adapt. The myth of timeless purity is not just a European story, it is a global story, entangled with colonialism, race, and commerce. As we move forward, we will see how Hollywood and advertising reinforced this globalization, turning the white gown into a global industry. We will explore how films, magazines, and bridal companies presented white as the only proper choice, erasing diversity and commodifying tradition.
But it is crucial to recognize that the foundation was laid here, in the age of empire, when colonial powers exported the white gown and imposed it on non-European societies. The myth of timeless purity became global not because it was ancient, but because it was imposed, and it continues to shape weddings today,
reminding us that tradition is often less about the past than about the power of colonization and commerce to define the present.
By the dawn of the 20th century, the white wedding dress had already gained traction among Europe's middle classes thanks to industrialization, photography, and the lingering influence of Queen Victoria's iconic gown. But it was in the 20th century that the white dress truly became entrenched as the only proper choice, not through timeless ritual, but through the machinery of capitalism and media. Hollywood films, glossy magazines, and bridal companies worked hand in hand to transform the white gown into a profitable industry, presenting it as ancient custom while selling it as modern necessity. This chapter explores how the marriage industry was built, how advertising reinforced the myth, and how cinema and consumer culture turned the white dress into a global symbol. The rise of Hollywood is central to this story. In the early decades of the 20th century, film became the most powerful medium of mass culture.
Movies reached millions of viewers, shaping fashion, behavior, and ideals. Weddings were a frequent subject, and brides on screen almost always wore white. From romantic comedies to melodramas, the image of the white-clad bride became a cinematic shorthand for love, purity, and respectability. Audiences absorbed these images, and the repetition reinforced the idea that white was the natural choice. The camera, which had already standardized the image of the wedding in photography, now projected it onto the silver screen, magnifying its cultural impact. Hollywood's influence was not accidental. Costume designers deliberately chose white gowns because they photographed well, stood out against darker backgrounds, and conveyed a sense of spectacle. Directors used the white dress to symbolize the climax of romance, the moment when love was sanctified and celebrated. The gown became a visual anchor, a symbol that audiences recognized instantly.
Over time, the cinematic bride in white became so familiar that it seemed inevitable. Few films depicted brides in other colors, and when they did, it was often framed as eccentric or rebellious. The white gown thus became not just a fashion choice, but a cinematic convention, shaping public imagination across generations. Magazines reinforced this imagery. Bridal magazines emerged in the early 20th century, offering advice, photographs, and advertisements to aspiring brides. These publications presented the white gown as the centerpiece of the wedding, framing it as both tradition and necessity. Articles emphasized its moral symbolism, linking it to purity and innocence, while advertisements promoted specific fabrics, styles, and designers. The gown was sold not just as clothing, but as identity, a marker of respectability and modernity. Brides were told that to marry properly, they must wear white, and magazines provided endless images to reinforce the message.
The repetition created a cultural expectation, turning a recent fashion into a supposed tradition. Advertising played a decisive role in commodifying the white gown. Bridal companies marketed gowns as essential purchases, presenting them as investments in morality, romance, and status. Advertisements emphasized the symbolism of white, but they also promoted consumption. The gown was sold as a product, one that required accessories, veils, shoes, and jewelry. The white dress became the anchor of a larger market, generating profit for designers, retailers, and advertisers. Consumer culture transformed the ritual into an industry, and the myth of timeless purity served as its marketing strategy. By presenting the gown as ancient, advertisers legitimized consumption, making it seem like tradition rather than commerce. The marriage industry expanded rapidly in the 20th century. Bridal shops proliferated, offering gowns in a range of styles and prices.
Department stores created bridal sections, catering to middle-class consumers. Designers specialized in wedding fashion, producing seasonal collections and promoting them through magazines and advertisements. The industry was not just about gowns. It encompassed photography, catering, decorations, and honeymoon packages. Weddings became commercial spectacles, and the white gown was the centerpiece. The myth of timeless purity was commodified, sold through every channel of consumer culture. What had once been a royal fashion statement was now a profitable industry. Hollywood and advertising worked together to reinforce this industry. Films depicted glamorous weddings, magazines published photographs of celebrity brides, and advertisers capitalized on the imagery. The synergy created a feedback loop. Audiences saw white gowns on screen, read about them in magazines, and purchased them in shops. The repetition created a cultural expectation,
making white seem inevitable. Brides who chose other colors were framed as unconventional, while those who wore white were celebrated as proper and respectable. The myth of timeless purity was thus reinforced by every medium, turning a modern invention into a cultural norm. The role of celebrity culture is particularly revealing. When film stars married, their weddings were widely reported, and photographs of their gowns circulated in magazines. These images reinforced the association between glamour and white, presenting the gown as both fashionable and traditional. Celebrity brides became trendsetters, and ordinary women imitated their choices. The white gown was not just a symbol of purity, it was a symbol of celebrity culture, glamour, and modernity. The myth of timeless purity was thus entangled with the allure of fame, making it even more powerful. It is important to recognize that this process was not neutral.
The white gown was presented as universal, but it was tied to patriarchal narratives about female purity. Advertising emphasized virginity, presenting the gown as a public display of innocence. Hollywood reinforced this narrative, depicting brides in white as virtuous and respectable. The myth served to regulate women's bodies and choices, making the gown not just a fashion trend, but a tool of social control. By presenting it as ancient, society naturalized these expectations, making them seem inevitable rather than constructed. The white gown thus served both commercial and ideological interests, legitimizing consumption while reinforcing patriarchy. At the same time, the gown was celebrated as a symbol of romance. Films depicted weddings as the climax of love stories, magazines emphasized devotion, and advertisements framed the gown as the embodiment of affection. The romantic narrative was powerful, aligning marriage with modern ideals of love and domesticity.
The white gown became a visual symbol of this narrative, presenting marriage as both moral and romantic. This framing was part of the broader reimagining of marriage in the 20th century, which emphasized love rather than alliances. The gown reinforced this narrative, making it seem timeless even though it was modern. The myth of timeless purity was thus entangled with the romantic ideal, making it even more compelling. The expansion of the marriage industry also reveals the power of capitalism to shape tradition. Weddings became opportunities for consumption, and the white gown was central to this market. Bridal companies promoted the idea that a proper wedding required a white dress, and families invested in gowns to display their respectability. The gown was sold as both tradition and necessity, legitimizing consumption by presenting it as ancient. The myth of timeless purity thus served the interests of industry, turning a modern invention into a profitable ritual.
Tradition was not ancient, it was manufactured by capitalism. The impact of this commercialization was profound. Generations grew up believing that brides had always worn white, even though the practice was barely a century old. The repetition of images in films, magazines, and advertisements created the illusion of timelessness, erasing the diversity of past practices. The myth silenced alternative traditions, presenting white as universal. Brides who chose other colors were marginalized, while those who wore white were celebrated. The white gown became not just a fashion choice, but a cultural expectation enforced by media and industry. The myth of timeless purity was thus cemented by capitalism, not history. Yet resistance persisted. Some brides chose alternative colors, challenging the norm. Feminist critiques exposed the patriarchal narratives behind the gown, questioning its symbolism of purity.
Artists and filmmakers experimented with alternative depictions, presenting brides in red, black, or patterned gowns. These practices challenged the myth, exposing its modern origins and revealing its commercial foundations. They remind us that tradition is not inevitable. It is contested, negotiated, and reimagined. The white gown may dominate, but it is not universal, and its history reveals the power of capitalism to manufacture tradition. This chapter also invites us to reflect on the broader dynamics of media and consumer culture. The white gown did not become dominant because it was ancient or universal. It became dominant because Hollywood, advertising, and the marriage industry promoted it relentlessly. Its symbolism was constructed, its universality manufactured, and its tradition commodified. The myth of timeless purity is a product of capitalism, not antiquity. By exposing this history, we challenge the narrative
and open space for alternative traditions.
We recognize that weddings are not timeless rituals, but modern spectacles shaped by media and industry. As we move forward, we will explore how brides and communities have resisted and reimagined the white gown, choosing alternative colors and symbols to challenge the myth. We will see how feminist critiques, queer weddings, and decolonial practices have exposed the gown's patriarchal and commercial foundations. But it is crucial to recognize that the foundation of the modern marriage industry was laid here, in the 20th century, when Hollywood, advertising, and capitalism transformed a fashion trend into a global ritual. The white gown is not timeless, it is a product of media and commerce. And its history reveals the power of capitalism to manufacture tradition, turning consumption into culture and profit into ritual. By the 20th century, the white wedding dress had been cemented as the dominant symbol of marriage in much of the world. Hollywood, advertising, and the bridal industry had presented it as the only proper choice, erasing centuries of colorful diversity and presenting whiteness as timeless tradition. Yet even as the myth hardened, cracks began to appear. Brides and communities challenged the narrative, choosing red, black, or culturally specific attire to resist the homogenizing force of the white gown. Feminist critiques exposed its patriarchal symbolism, queer weddings reimagined its meaning, and decolonial practices reclaimed suppressed traditions. This chapter explores these rebellions, showing how alternative colors and practices contest the myth of timeless purity. Let us begin with the most striking alternative, the black wedding dress. In Western culture, black is often associated with mourning, death, or rebellion.
To wear black at a wedding is to defy convention, to reject the narrative of purity and innocence. Yet throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, some brides have chosen black gowns precisely for this reason. They wanted to assert individuality, to challenge patriarchal expectations, or simply to embrace a color they loved. Black gowns appeared in avant-garde fashion shows, in celebrity weddings, and in alternative communities. Each instance challenged the myth, exposing its constructed nature. If white was supposedly timeless, why did black feel so powerful, so transgressive, so modern? The answer lies in the myth itself. White was never inevitable, and black revealed the possibility of choice. Red, too, became a color of rebellion in Western weddings, even as it remained traditional in many non-European cultures. In China and India, red had long symbolized luck, fertility, and auspiciousness. Brides wore red robes or saris, and the color dominated the ceremony.
Colonial powers had tried to suppress these traditions, promoting white as superior. Yet many communities resisted, continuing to wear red even under pressure. In the 20th century, red also became a symbol of rebellion in Western weddings. Brides who chose red gowns challenged the narrative of purity, embracing passion, strength, and individuality. Red was both traditional and modern, both cultural and rebellious. It revealed the diversity of meanings that color could carry, exposing the narrowness of the white gown myth. Culturally specific attire also challenged the myth. In Japan, brides continued to wear elaborate kimonos, often in vibrant colors and patterns. In Africa, brides celebrated weddings with textiles that reflected local traditions, from kente cloth in Ghana to shwe prints in South Africa. In indigenous communities across the Americas, brides wore garments that reflected cultural identity, from beaded dresses to woven fabrics. These practices resisted the homogenizing force of the white gown, asserting that tradition was diverse, not universal. They challenged the colonial narrative that presented white as superior, reclaiming suppressed histories and identities. By wearing culturally specific attire, brides contested the myth of timeless purity, exposing its Eurocentric bias and reclaiming their own traditions. Feminist critiques added another layer of rebellion. Feminists exposed the patriarchal symbolism of the white gown, questioning its association with virginity and purity. They argued that the gown reduced women to their sexual history, presenting marriage as the transfer of innocence from bride to husband. By rejecting white, feminist brides challenged this narrative, asserting autonomy and individuality. Some chose black or red gowns, Others wore suits or culturally specific attire. The choice itself was a statement. Tradition was not inevitable, and women had the power to redefine it. Feminist critiques revealed the white gown as a tool of social control, and alternative colors became symbols of resistance. Queer weddings also reimagined the white gown. In same-sex marriages, the symbolism of purity and transfer was disrupted, exposing the gown's patriarchal foundations. Queer couples often chose alternative attire, from matching suits to colorful gowns, rejecting the heteronormative narrative of the white dress. Some embraced white but reinterpreted its meaning, presenting it as a symbol of love rather than purity. Others rejected it entirely, choosing colors that reflected their identities and communities. Queer weddings revealed the flexibility of tradition, showing that rituals could be reimagined to reflect diverse experiences. They challenged the myth by exposing its heteronormative bias, asserting that marriage was not bound by whiteness or patriarchy. Decolonial practices added yet another dimension.
Communities across the world reclaimed suppressed traditions, rejecting the colonial imposition of the white gown. In India, brides continued to wear red saris, asserting cultural pride. In Africa, brides celebrated vibrant textiles, reclaiming traditions that had been marginalized. In indigenous communities, brides wore garments that reflected cultural identity, resisting the erasure of colonial narratives. These practices exposed the white gown as a colonial invention, not an ancient universal. They reclaimed diversity, asserting that tradition was not white but plural. Decolonial practices revealed the myth as a tool of domination, and alternative attire became a symbol of resistance. Hybrid practices also flourished, blending white with alternative colors and symbols. Brides wore white gowns with red sashes, black accessories, or cultural textiles. They combined European fashion with local traditions, creating new forms that reflected both resistance and adaptation.
These practices revealed the complexity of cultural encounters, showing that tradition was not static but dynamic. They challenged the myth by exposing its constructed nature, revealing that weddings could be diverse, hybrid, and creative. Hybrid practices contested the narrative of timeless purity, asserting that tradition was not ancient but constantly reimagined. Celebrity culture amplified these rebellions. When celebrities chose alternative colors, their weddings were widely reported and photographs circulated in magazines. These images challenged the narrative, presenting black, red, or culturally specific attire as glamorous and fashionable. Celebrity brides became trendsetters, and ordinary women imitated their choices. The white gown was not universal, it was contested, and alternative colors gained visibility. Celebrity culture revealed the power of media to reshape tradition, showing that rebellion could be fashionable as well as political.
Art and fashion also played a role. Designers experimented with alternative colors, presenting black, red, and patterned gowns on runways. Artists depicted brides in diverse attire, challenging the narrative of whiteness. These practices exposed the gown as a fashion trend, not a timeless ritual. They revealed the creativity of tradition, showing that weddings could be sites of artistic expression as well as social ritual. Art and fashion contested the myth by exposing its commercial foundations, revealing that the white gown was a product of industry, not history. The impact of these rebellions is profound. They expose the myth of timeless purity, revealing the white gown as a modern invention. They reclaim diversity, asserting that tradition is plural, not universal. They challenge patriarchy, heteronormativity, and colonialism, exposing the gown as a tool of social control. They reveal the power of choice, showing that weddings can be sites of resistance as well as conformity.
By choosing alternative colors and culturally specific attire, brides contest the myth, reclaim history, and reimagine tradition. Yet the myth persists. The white gown remains dominant, reinforced by media, industry, and cultural expectation. Brides who choose alternative colors are often framed as unconventional, while those who wear white are celebrated as proper. The myth continues to shape weddings, even as it is contested. This tension reveals the power of tradition and the difficulty of resistance. Yet it also reveals the possibility of change. Each rebellion, each alternative choice, exposes the myth and opens space for new traditions. The white gown may dominate, but it is not inevitable, and its history reveals the power of resistance. This chapter invites us to reflect on the meaning of tradition itself. Tradition is not ancient or universal. It is constructed, contested, and reimagined.
The white gown is not timeless. It is a modern invention, imposed by power and reinforced by industry. Alternative colors and practices reveal the diversity of human experience, challenging the myth and reclaiming history. They remind us that weddings are not static rituals, but dynamic spectacles, shaped by choice, identity, and resistance. By contesting the myth, brides and communities assert autonomy, reclaim diversity, and reimagine tradition. As we move forward, we will explore the conclusion of this journey, asking the central question: right or wrong, is the white wedding dress truly an age-old ritual? We will see how the evidence dismantles the myth, revealing the gown as a modern invention. We will reflect on why the myth matters, how it shapes identity, and what alternative futures might look like. But it is crucial to recognize that the myth is contested and that resistance persists. The white gown may dominate, but it is not inevitable.
And the rebellions of brides who choose red, black, or culturally specific attire remind us that tradition is always open to reimagination.
We have traced the journey of the white wedding dress from its supposed ancient roots to its actual modern invention. We have seen how Queen Victoria's choice in 1840 transformed a rare fashion into a trend, how industrialization and photography spread it, how colonial powers imposed it globally, and how Hollywood and advertising cemented it as the only proper choice. We have also seen how brides and communities resisted, choosing red, black, or culturally specific attire to contest the myth. Now, in this final chapter, we return to the central question: right or wrong, is the white wedding dress truly an age-old ritual? The evidence is clear. It is not ancient, not universal, and not inevitable. It is a modern invention shaped by power, fashion, and industry. But the story does not end there. We must reflect on why the myth matters, how it influences identity and culture, and what alternative futures might look like. The first point to emphasize is that myths matter, even when they are wrong. The white wedding dress myth persists because it serves powerful social functions. It gives weddings a sense of continuity, anchoring them in a supposed ancient past. It reassures families that they are participating in something timeless, something bigger than themselves. It legitimizes consumption, presenting the purchase of a gown as tradition rather than commerce. And it reinforces patriarchal narratives about female purity, presenting virginity as a public performance. The myth is wrong in its claim of antiquity, but it is right in revealing the human desire for continuity, morality, and identity. That is why it matters. It shapes how people imagine themselves, their families, and their communities. The influence of the myth on identity is profound. For many brides, wearing white is not just about fashion, it is about belonging.
It connects them to a larger narrative, one that feels timeless, even though it is modern. It signals respectability, aligning them with cultural expectations. It provides a sense of ritual, marking the transition from single life to marriage. The gown becomes a symbol of identity, one that is deeply personal, yet socially constructed. Brides may feel pressure to conform, but they may also embrace the gown as a meaningful choice. The myth shapes identity by presenting white as inevitable, even when history tells us otherwise. The influence on culture is equally significant. The white gown has become a global symbol, appearing in films, advertisements, and photographs across cultures. It has reshaped weddings, turning them into commercial spectacles centered on consumption. It has marginalized alternative traditions, presenting them as eccentric or folkloric. It has reinforced racialized narratives, associating whiteness with purity and superiority. The myth has thus reshaped cultural imagination, narrowing diversity and imposing a Eurocentric standard. Its influence is not neutral. It reflects power, commerce, and ideology. By presenting white as ancient, the myth legitimizes these forces, making them seem natural rather than constructed. Yet the persistence of resistance reveals the possibility of alternative futures. Brides who choose red, black, or culturally specific attire challenge the myth, reclaiming diversity and autonomy. Feminist critiques expose the patriarchal symbolism of the gown, questioning its association with virginity.
Queer weddings reimagine its meaning, disrupting heteronormative narratives. Decolonial practices reclaim suppressed traditions, resisting the colonial imposition of white. These rebellions reveal that tradition is not static, but dynamic, not inevitable, but contested. They open space for new possibilities, showing that weddings can be sites of creativity, resistance, and reimagination.
What might these alternative futures look like? One possibility is a pluralistic approach, where brides choose colors and styles that reflect their identities and communities. Weddings could celebrate diversity, embracing red saris, patterned kimonos, vibrant textiles, and black gowns alongside white. Tradition would be redefined as plural, not universal, recognizing the richness of human experience. Another possibility is a minimalistic approach, where brides reject consumption and choose simple attire, challenging the commercialization of weddings. This would redefine tradition as authenticity rather than consumption, resisting the marriage industry. A third possibility is a symbolic approach, where brides choose colors that reflect personal values: green for renewal, blue for faithfulness, red for passion, reclaiming the symbolism of color from the narrow narrative of white. These futures reveal the possibility of choice, creativity, and autonomy.
The future of the white gown itself is also worth considering. It may persist as a dominant symbol, reinforced by media and industry, but its meaning may shift, reinterpreted by brides and communities. Some may embrace it as a symbol of love rather than purity, detaching it from patriarchal narratives. Others may reinterpret it as a fashion choice, not a moral necessity. The gown may remain popular, but its symbolism may evolve, reflecting new values and identities. The myth may weaken, but the gown may persist, reimagined in diverse ways. This reveals the complexity of tradition. It is not simply abandoned, but reinterpreted, reshaped, and reimagined. The broader lesson of the white wedding dress is that tradition is often less about the past than about power in the present. The gown is not ancient, it is modern. Its dominance reflects industrialization, colonization, and consumer culture. Its symbolism reflects patriarchy, heteronormativity, and Eurocentrism.
Its persistence reflects media, advertising, and industry. The myth of timeless purity is thus a case study in how traditions are invented, imposed, and naturalized. It reveals the power of elites, industries, and ideologies to shape rituals, and the possibility of resistance to reclaim diversity. By exposing the myth, we do not destroy tradition, we open space for new possibilities. This chapter also invites us to reflect on the role of history itself. History is not just about facts, it is about narratives, myths, and power. The white wedding dress reveals how myths are constructed, how they persist, and how they shape identity. It shows that history is contested, that traditions are reimagined, and that myths matter even when they are wrong. By exposing the myth, we challenge the narrative and reclaim history. We recognize that weddings are not timeless rituals, but modern spectacles shaped by power, commerce, and resistance.
History becomes a tool of liberation, revealing the constructed nature of tradition and opening space for autonomy. So, right or wrong, is the white wedding dress truly an age-old ritual? The answer is clear: wrong. It is not ancient, not universal, and not inevitable. It is a modern invention, shaped by power, fashion, and industry. But the myth matters, because it shapes identity and culture. It legitimizes consumption, reinforces patriarchy, and narrows diversity. It also reveals the human desire for continuity, morality, and identity. And it is contested, resisted, and reimagined. The future of the white gown is not predetermined. It is open to choice, creativity, and autonomy. The myth may persist, but it will be challenged, and new traditions will emerge. In closing, the story of the white wedding dress is not just about fabric and fashion. It is about power, myth, and identity. It is about how traditions are invented, imposed, and contested.
It is about how myths matter, even when they are wrong. And it is about the possibility of alternative futures, where diversity is celebrated, autonomy is asserted, and tradition is reimagined. The white gown may dominate, but it is not inevitable. Its history reveals the power of myth, and its future reveals the possibility of resistance. The white wedding dress is not an age-old ritual, it is a modern invention. And by exposing the myth, we reclaim history, resist domination, and open space for new traditions that reflect the richness of human experience.